It was supposed to be just another day in the quiet town of Millstone, a place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. The sun was shining, the streets were calm, and life moved at its usual, predictable pace. But little did anyone know that day would set off a chain of events no one in town would ever forget. At the heart of it all were two men from entirely different walks of life. One, a small-town police officer with a chip on his shoulder, and the other, a decorated U.S. Army general who had spent his entire life serving his country. Their worlds collided in a way that no one could have predicted, sparking a story of injustice, karma, and redemption. Officer Ryan Hayes prided himself on being tough. He was the kind of cop who liked to maintain order, but his methods often raised eyebrows. People whispered about his tendency to overstep, especially when it came to certain individuals in the community. Ryan didn't care much for whispers, though. To him, the badge gave him authority. His word was law. But that authority was about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. General Marcus Caldwell had been driving through Millstone that afternoon on his way to a speaking engagement at a nearby veterans center. A man of integrity and humility, Marcus wasn't the type to flaunt his rank or achievements. He had served in some of the toughest combat zones around the world, earning the respect and admiration of his peers. But here in this small town, far from any military base or big city crowd, he was just another man behind the wheel of an SUV. The trouble began when Ryan Hayes noticed Marcus's vehicle parked slightly over the faded white line of a gas station parking spot. A minor thing, something most people wouldn't even think twice about. But for Ryan, it was the kind of thing he lived for. A chance to assert control. He approached the vehicle with a swagger, his hand already hovering near his belt as if expecting trouble. Marcus was inside the store, grabbing a bottle of water for the road, completely unaware of what was brewing outside. By the time he walked back to his car, Ryan was already there, tapping his flashlight against the window in what felt more like a warning than a request. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," Ryan barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Confused but calm, Marcus complied. His military training had taught him to handle tense situations with grace. He introduced himself politely, extending a hand out of habit. "Good afternoon, officer. I'm General Marcus Caldwell." Ryan cut him off mid-sentence. "I don't care who you are. You're parked illegally, and I'm gonna need to see your license and registration." His tone was cold, dismissive, almost mocking. The situation escalated quickly. Ryan's tone grew harsher as he questioned Marcus, accusing him of being evasive and even disrespectful. Witnesses began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some recognized Marcus from local news segments about his military service, while others were simply curious about the scene unfolding. Despite his growing frustration, Marcus remained calm, trying to explain himself. But Ryan wasn't interested in explanations. Instead, he reached for his handcuffs. The crowd gasped as the officer roughly pulled the Army general's arms behind his back. "You're under arrest," Ryan declared. "For what?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then muttered something about resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. It was clear to those watching that the charges didn't add up. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people pulled out their phones to record. And just like that, Marcus Caldwell, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the freedoms of others, found himself in handcuffs in the middle of a gas station parking lot. The humiliation was palpable, but Marcus held his head high, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the officer's aggression. But what happened next was something no one saw coming, not the onlookers, not Ryan Hayes, and certainly not Marcus Caldwell. As the footage of the arrest began to circulate online, the story took on a life of its own. People across the country were enraged, demanding answers and justice. And that's when the real twist began to unfold. Because karma has a way of evening the score, and Ryan Hayes was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Let me know how else I can refine this or add further elements. The arrest of General Marcus Caldwell spread like wildfire. Within hours, the shaky cell phone footage from the gas station was uploaded to social media. At first, it was just a local incident, a video shared in small community groups with captions like "Unbelievable" and "What's happening in our town?" But as more people watched, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. The clip showed Marcus standing tall and composed, his hands cuffed behind him, while Officer Ryan Hayes paced around him, barking orders. To many, the scene was jarring. This wasn't some unknown civilian being arrested. This was a highly respected Army general. The comments started flooding in. Veterans chimed in, furious at the disrespect shown to one of their own. Civilians from across the country, many of whom had never served, shared the same outrage. "This man fought for our freedom," one comment read, "and this is how he's treated." Another added, "The way that officer handled him was disgusting." You can see the restraint on Marcus's face. He could have blown up, but he didn't. That's real leadership. While the internet raged, Marcus sat quietly in a holding cell at the Millstone police station. He hadn't said much since arriving. His years of military service had prepared him for moments of adversity, but even he couldn't quite make sense of what had just happened. In his heart, he knew that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was about something bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Ryan Hayes, on the other hand, was riding high on a sense of accomplishment. He strutted around the station, proud of himself for what he believed was the enforcement of the law. In his mind, Marcus had challenged his authority, and no one got away with that, not even a general. "Nobody's above the law," Ryan muttered to one of his colleagues, though the other officer just nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. What Ryan didn't realize was that his actions had already begun to catch up with him. The police chief, a seasoned man named Frank Morales, was watching the events unfold with a heavy heart. Frank had known Ryan for years and had always tried to overlook his more aggressive tendencies. But this was different. Frank knew exactly who Marcus Caldwell was, a man who had given his life to serving his country, who had inspired countless soldiers under his command. Frank also knew the backlash they were about to face as a department. It wasn't long before Frank's phones started ringing off the hook. Calls from reporters, community leaders, and even higher-ups from the state level flooded in, all asking the same question. Why was General Caldwell arrested? Frank didn't have a good answer. He didn't even know how to explain it to himself. Meanwhile, back at the station, Marcus was finally allowed a phone call. He dialed the number of his longtime friend and legal advisor, Angela Harris. Angela was a no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. When Marcus explained what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, are you telling me a cop arrested you for parking slightly over a line?" Angela asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "That's what he said," Marcus replied. "But let's be honest, Angela. This wasn't about parking. You know that as well as I do." Angela did know. She'd seen cases like this before. Instances where authority figures use their power as a weapon rather than a tool for justice. But this time, it wasn't just any man who had been wronged. It was Marcus Caldwell, a man whose character and accomplishments stood in stark contrast to the petty actions of Officer Hayes. "Don't worry, Marcus," Angela said firmly. "We're going to handle this. I'm on my way." While Angela prepared to confront the situation, the public outrage continued to grow. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the arrest footage on a loop. Anchors debated whether the officer's actions were racially motivated, while commentators questioned the culture within the Millstone Police Department. Was this an isolated incident, or was it part of a larger pattern? In the town of Millstone itself, people were torn. Some supported Ryan Hayes, arguing that he was just doing his job, and that Marcus should have complied without question. Others were appalled, pointing to the footage as evidence of Ryan's unnecessary aggression. The local diner buzzed with heated conversations as neighbors took sides, their usual small talk replaced with fiery debates. Amid all this, Marcus's character began to shine even brighter. As more details about his life emerged, the public learned about his decades of service, his leadership in disaster relief efforts, and his work mentoring young soldiers. Veterans across the country began sharing their own stories about Marcus. How he had saved lives on the battlefield, how he had written personal letters to the families of fallen soldiers, how he had always put others before himself. For every story about Marcus, there was another about Ryan Hayes, but not the kind he would have wanted. Former classmates, ex-colleagues, and even some of his current coworkers began speaking out about his history of confrontational behavior. Ryan always had a temper, one former friend said in an anonymous interview. He didn't like being questioned, and he definitely didn't like being told he was wrong. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. Protesters began gathering outside the Millstone police station, holding signs that read "Justice for General Caldwell" and "Accountability Now." Ryan's colleagues started distancing themselves, worried about being associated with him. Even Chief Morales couldn't ignore the weight of the situation any longer. Inside his office, Frank Morales stared at the growing pile of reports on his desk. Letters from community leaders, statements from witnesses, and transcripts of phone calls. It was all too much. He rubbed his temples, feeling the kind of stress that only years in law enforcement could bring. Deep down, Frank knew that the situation was no longer just about Ryan or Marcus. It was about the integrity of the department, the trust of the community, and the message they wanted to send to the world. But while Frank grappled with his conscience, Marcus was preparing for the next step. Angela had arrived in Millstone, and the two were strategizing in a small conference room at a local law firm. Marcus's calm demeanor had never wavered, but there was a fire in his eyes now, a determination to turn this incident into something meaningful. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This is about everyone who's ever been mistreated, who's ever been disrespected because of the color of their skin or their position in life. We have an opportunity to shine a light on this, Angela. Let's not waste it." Angela nodded, her own resolve hardening. She knew Marcus wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for justice, not just for himself, but for others who couldn't speak up. And as they planned their next move, the tension in the air grew thicker. Back at the station, Ryan Hayes was beginning to feel the weight of his decisions. The once confident officer was now avoiding eye contact with his coworkers, and the swagger in his step had disappeared. For the first time, he realized he might have gone too far, but it was too late to turn back now. And as the sun set on another tense day in Millstone, one thing was clear: the storm was far from over. What had started as a single act of arrogance had become a national reckoning, and everyone involved was about to face the consequences of their actions. As the days passed, the weight of the incident bore down on everyone involved. For Marcus Caldwell, the waiting was the hardest part. He had spent his life in motion, on the front lines, in command centers, and on stages delivering speeches about leadership and resilience. Now he was stuck in a strange kind of limbo, watching a storm that he had never intended to create. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew that his arrest had struck a nerve in the country, especially at a time when issues of race, power, and justice were already under a magnifying glass. Meanwhile, Ryan Hayes was beginning to feel the full consequences of his actions. At first, he had brushed off the backlash, believing it would blow over. He told himself that he was just enforcing the law, that Marcus Caldwell was no different from anyone else. But as the protests grew louder and the calls for accountability became impossible to ignore, Ryan found himself questioning the decisions he had made that day. Inside the station, the tension was palpable. Officers who had once been friendly with Ryan now kept their distance, wary of being associated with the controversy. Some whispered that Ryan had finally gone too far, while others wondered how much longer Chief Morales would let the situation fester. Ryan felt the isolation keenly, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. At the same time, Marcus's legal team was working tirelessly. Angela Harris had assembled a group of lawyers, activists, and public relations experts to handle the growing media attention. They held strategy meetings late into the night, analyzing every detail of the case and preparing for the inevitable legal battle. But it wasn't just about the law, it was about the story. Marcus had made it clear from the start that he wanted to use this moment to spark a conversation. "This isn't just about me," he reminded Angela and her team during one of their meetings. "This is about what's happening all over the country. We need to make sure that the message is clear. This kind of behavior has to stop." Angela agreed, but she also knew how tricky the situation was. The media had already started framing the incident as a clash of egos, a battle between a proud officer and a humble general. But Angela saw it differently. To her, this wasn't about egos. It was about power and how it was wielded. And as she dug deeper into Ryan Hayes' record, she began to uncover a troubling pattern. It turned out that this wasn't the first time Ryan had been accused of overstepping his authority. There were complaints in his file, allegations of unnecessary force, racial profiling, and even verbal abuse. Most of these complaints had been quietly dismissed, but now, in the light of Marcus's arrest, they took on a new significance. Angela's team started reaching out to some of the people who had filed those complaints, piecing together a picture of a man who had long used his badge as a shield for his insecurities. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the story became. One of the complainants was a local high school teacher who had been pulled over by Ryan for a broken taillight. She described how Ryan had humiliated her in front of her students, making her feel small and powerless. Another was an older man who claimed that Ryan had searched his car without cause during a routine traffic stop. These stories didn't just add weight to Marcus's case. They painted a picture of a systemic problem within the Millstone Police Department. But Ryan wasn't the only one facing scrutiny. As the media continued to dissect the incident, questions were raised about the department's leadership. Why had Chief Morales allowed Ryan's behavior to go unchecked for so long? Was this an isolated case, or was it part of a broader culture within the department? Frank Morales found himself under pressure from all sides. Community leaders demanded answers, state officials hinted at an investigation, and even his own officers began questioning his ability to lead. Frank spent sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience. He had always prided himself on being a fair and just leader, but now he wondered if he had been too lenient with officers like Ryan. Deep down, he knew that Marcus Caldwell's arrest was a symptom of a larger problem, one that he could no longer ignore. While all of this unfolded, the town of Millstone found itself at the center of a national debate. News vans lined the streets, reporters camped outside the police station, and protesters filled the town square. Some carried signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Misconduct," while others held banners supporting Ryan, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. The divide in the community grew deeper with each passing day. One of the most poignant moments came when a group of veterans organized a rally in support of Marcus. They stood in their uniforms, medals gleaming in the sun, and spoke about the values of honor, respect, and justice. "General Caldwell represents the best of us," one of the veterans said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He's a man who has sacrificed so much for this country. And to see him treated like this, it's not just an insult to him. It's an insult to all of us." As the rally played out, Marcus watched from a distance. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he couldn't help feeling a swell of gratitude for the people who had come to support him. At the same time, he felt the weight of their expectations. He knew that this fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for something bigger. The small town of Millstone had become a powder keg, with the tension threatening to explode at any moment. As the national spotlight grew brighter, the stakes for everyone involved reached new heights. News anchors debated the legal and moral implications of the arrest. Talk shows brought in panelists to argue both sides, and hashtags calling for justice trended across social media. For Marcus Caldwell, the outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it came with a sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him. He had always been a man of action, but now he had to rely on a system that often moved slowly and unpredictably. Angela Harris worked around the clock, reviewing every piece of evidence and preparing for what was shaping up to be a landmark case. The stories from others who had encountered Officer Hayes were invaluable, but they also painted a sobering picture of a flawed system. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a culture that allowed those actions to go unchecked. Marcus agreed to let Angela weave these stories into their broader narrative, knowing that this was bigger than him. Meanwhile, Ryan Hayes found himself increasingly cornered. The pressure was relentless. His name had become synonymous with abuse of power, and every new revelation about his past behavior added fuel to the fire. He couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of judgmental stares. Strangers sent angry letters to his home, and his phone buzzed constantly with calls he dared not answer. His world, once defined by his badge and authority, was now crumbling around him. Ryan's family tried to shield him from the fallout, but even they couldn't escape the backlash. His teenage daughter came home in tears after classmates taunted her, and his wife started avoiding public places altogether. Ryan's temper, which had always simmered beneath the surface, began to boil over. He lashed out at his colleagues, snapping at anyone who dared to question him. But deep down, a seed of doubt had taken root. For the first time, Ryan began to wonder if he had truly been in the right that day. Back at the station, Ryan Hayes was spiraling. The public outrage, the isolation from his colleagues, and the growing pile of evidence against him had pushed him to the edge. He tried to defend himself in interviews, but his words only seemed to make things worse. "I was just doing my job," he said during one particularly tense exchange with a reporter. People need to understand that the law applies to everyone, no matter who they are. But the reporter wasn't buying it. "Officer Hayes," she said pointedly, "do you really believe that parking over a line justifies an arrest? Or was this about something else?" Ryan had no good answer. He mumbled something about maintaining order and walked away, his confidence visibly shaken. The tension reached a boiling point when Angela Harris announced that Marcus Caldwell would be filing a formal complaint against the Millstone Police Department. The announcement sent shockwaves through the town, setting the stage for what promised to be a high-profile legal battle. But for Marcus, it wasn't about the courtroom, it was about the message. As he stood before a crowd of reporters, Marcus spoke with a quiet dignity that had defined his entire career. "This is not about one man or one officer," he said. This is about accountability. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And it's about building a better future for all of us. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus remained stoic. He knew that the fight was far from over. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town of Millstone, one thing was certain: the story was only just beginning. As Marcus stepped outside the community center, he was greeted by the cold night air and a wall of noise. The shouting from the two groups had grown louder, and it was clear the police were struggling to keep things under control. The tension hung in the air like a tightly wound wire, ready to snap at any moment. Angela rushed to his side, her expression a mixture of concern and urgency. She motioned for him to stay close as they moved toward the car waiting to take them back to the hotel. But before they could leave, a sudden commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. A loud crash pierced the air, followed by a chorus of startled screams. Marcus and Angela turned in unison, their eyes scanning the chaos for the source of the disturbance. One of the barricades separating the groups had been knocked over, and a small scuffle had broken out. The officers on the scene moved in quickly, but the tension only seemed to escalate. Protesters from both sides began shouting over each other, their words drowned out by the growing noise. For a brief moment, Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to get in the car and leave, to distance himself from the chaos and let the authorities handle it. But another part of him, the part that had spent decades leading troops in high-pressure situations, felt a responsibility to step in. He exchanged a look with Angela, who gave a reluctant nod. "Just be careful," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. Marcus moved toward the crowd, his towering presence immediately commanding attention. He raised his hands in a calming gesture, his voice steady but firm. "Enough," he called out, his deep tone cutting through the cacophony. "This is not how we solve anything." The crowd hesitated, the energy shifting slightly as people turned to see who was speaking. Marcus continued, his words deliberate. "We're better than this. We came here tonight to have a conversation, to demand justice and accountability, not to tear each other apart. Don't let anger blind you to the real fight." For a moment, it seemed like his words were having an effect. The shouting subsided, and some of the protesters stepped back, creating a little more space between the groups. But the peace was short-lived. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice shouted, "What about the cops? They're the problem." The statement acted like a spark to dry kindling, reigniting the tension. Another voice, this time from Ryan's supporters, shouted back, and the fragile calm began to crumble. Marcus could feel the situation slipping out of control, but before he could say anything else, a sharp sound rang out, a single crack that silenced the entire crowd. For a second, no one moved. The noise had come from a small group near the back of the crowd, where a young protester was clutching his hand in pain. He had thrown a bottle toward the opposing group, but it had shattered midair, its glass shards raining down. The sight of the broken bottle seemed to freeze everyone in place, their eyes darting between Marcus, the police, and each other. Then out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed something, or rather someone. Standing just beyond the edge of the crowd was Ryan Hayes. He wasn't in uniform, but there was no mistaking him. He was watching the scene unfold, his face unreadable. Marcus felt a jolt of surprise. He hadn't expected Ryan to show up, especially not like this. But what caught Marcus's attention even more was the look in Ryan's eyes. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was something closer to doubt, even regret. Ryan seemed to realize he had been spotted and started to turn away, but Marcus didn't let him leave. "Officer Hayes." Marcus called out, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. The tension shifted again, all eyes now focused on Ryan. He stopped in his tracks, clearly torn between leaving and staying. Marcus took a step forward, his gaze steady. "If you have something to say, now's the time." Ryan hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He looked at the crowd, then back at Marcus. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually speak. But before he could, a police officer approached Marcus, urging him to leave. "We need to get you out of here, sir. It's not safe." Reluctantly, Marcus allowed himself to be escorted to the waiting car, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. Ryan's presence, his hesitation, it was a thread that Marcus couldn't ignore. As the car pulled away, Angela turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What was that about?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his mind racing. "But I think Ryan Hayes is starting to question himself. And that might be the key to all of this." Angela nodded thoughtfully, but neither of them had time to dwell on it. Back at the hotel, a new development awaited them. One of Angela's team members had uncovered a piece of evidence that could change everything. A recording from the body camera of an officer who had been present during Marcus's arrest. The footage had been buried deep in the department's files, likely overlooked in the chaos. When Angela played the video, the room fell silent. The footage showed not only Ryan's actions, but also the reactions of his fellow officers. One officer could be heard questioning Ryan's decision to escalate the situation, while another tried to de-escalate but was quickly overruled. The video painted a damning picture, not just of Ryan's behavior, but of a culture that allowed it to persist. Marcus watched the screen intently, his jaw tightening. This was the kind of evidence that could turn the tide, but it also raised new questions. If this footage had been hidden, what else might be lurking in the department's files? And how far would some people go to protect themselves? The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. As Marcus and Angela prepared for the next phase of their fight, the storm continued to brew, threatening to upend everything they thought they knew. But one thing was clear: the truth was coming, and no one would escape its reach. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The trial had become a national spectacle, with cameras stationed outside the courthouse and reporters analyzing every move. Inside, the tension was palpable as Marcus Caldwell sat at the plaintiff's table beside Angela Harris. Across the room, Ryan Hayes looked worn, his once confident demeanor replaced with quiet unease. He avoided Marcus's gaze, keeping his focus on his attorney and the stack of papers in front of him. The body camera footage had shaken the foundation of the case. Angela had built her arguments around it, using the damning evidence to show not only the blatant misconduct during Marcus's arrest, but also the systemic issues within the Millstone Police Department. The footage had sparked outrage, with many questioning how such evidence could have been hidden for so long. Angela made it clear in her opening statement: "This is not just about what happened to Marcus Caldwell. This is about accountability. This is about justice." Throughout the trial, witnesses were called to the stand. Officers who had been present during the arrest testified, some reluctantly admitting they had felt uneasy about Ryan's actions. Community members shared their own encounters with Ryan, painting a picture of a man who had allowed his authority to overshadow his judgment. Each testimony added weight to Marcus's case, building toward what felt like an inevitable conclusion. Ryan Hayes, however, had yet to take the stand. His attorney had been hesitant, knowing the risk of putting him in front of the jury. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that Ryan's silence was only hurting his case. On the final day of testimony, he finally rose and walked to the witness stand, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was silent as Ryan took his oath. He sat stiffly, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. His attorney asked a series of rehearsed questions, giving Ryan the opportunity to explain his actions that day. He spoke about the stress of his job, the split-second decisions officers often had to make, and his belief at the time that he was doing what was necessary. But when Angela cross-examined him, the atmosphere shifted. Her questions were precise, cutting through his rehearsed answers. "Officer Hayes, you've stated that you believed Mr. Caldwell was resisting. Yet in the footage, he is seen standing calmly, complying with your requests. Can you explain how that constitutes resistance?" Ryan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I misread the situation," he admitted quietly. Angela pressed further. "And when your colleagues questioned your actions, you overruled them. Why?" Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Angela seized the moment. "Officer Hayes, was your decision to arrest Mr. Caldwell influenced by his race?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the room. Ryan looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time. The tension in the room was unbearable as Ryan took a deep breath. "I didn't think it was," he said finally, his voice strained. "But looking back now, I can't say it wasn't." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ryan's admission was shocking, not just for what it revealed about his mindset, but for the vulnerability it showed. He was no longer the defiant officer defending his actions. He was a man grappling with the consequences of his choices. The trial concluded later that day, and the jury deliberated for hours before reaching a verdict. When they returned, the foreperson announced that the jury had found in favor of Marcus Caldwell. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and quiet tears. Marcus sat still for a moment, letting the verdict sink in. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile soft but triumphant. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric with emotion. Supporters cheered as Marcus and Angela emerged, flanked by reporters eager for a statement. Marcus spoke briefly, his words measured and heartfelt. This case was never about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right. "I hope this verdict sends a message that accountability matters and that we can work together to create real change." But as the crowd dispersed and the media frenzy began to fade, a final twist emerged. A journalist from a national outlet approached Angela with new information. An anonymous source within the Millstone Police Department had come forward with additional evidence. The source revealed that the body camera footage wasn't just overlooked. It had been deliberately hidden by higher-ups in the department. Angela's face hardened as she absorbed the revelation. If this was true, it pointed to a deeper level of corruption within the department, one that went beyond Ryan Hayes. The battle they thought they had won might just be the beginning of a larger fight. Marcus, too, felt the weight of the news. He had achieved justice for himself, but the road to systemic change was far from over. As he looked out at the gathering storm clouds on the horizon, he knew he couldn't turn away. This was his fight, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. The story of Marcus Caldwell and Ryan Hayes didn't end with a verdict. It became a catalyst for a movement, one that challenged a broken system and demanded accountability at every level. And while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. In the weeks that followed the trial, life seemed to shift in ways Marcus Caldwell hadn't anticipated. The courthouse victory was monumental, but it wasn't the end. The revelation of hidden evidence within the Millstone Police Department sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Investigations were launched, and the department found itself under intense scrutiny. Marcus had hoped for change, but he hadn't imagined it would come so quickly or so messily. Angela was already knee-deep in the new case, working tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the corruption. Her small office had transformed into a command center, with whiteboards covered in notes, timelines, and photographs. Marcus would visit her occasionally, lending his insights and steady presence. Though he was no longer in uniform, his leadership instincts were as sharp as ever. "I've been thinking," Angela said one evening as she sifted through documents. "This isn't just about Millstone. Cases like yours are happening all over the country. If we can expose this, it could set a precedent for reform nationwide." Marcus nodded, but his expression was cautious. "It's a noble goal, Angela. But systemic change takes time. People need to be ready to listen, and not everyone is." Angela smiled faintly. "That's why we have to keep pushing. If we don't, who will?" Meanwhile, Ryan Hayes' life had taken a dramatic turn. After the trial, he was suspended pending an internal review. The community's reaction to him was mixed. Some viewed his admission in court as a step toward accountability, while others saw it as too little, too late. Ryan kept a low profile, avoiding public spaces and spending most of his days in quiet reflection. One day, to Marcus's surprise, Ryan reached out. The message was brief, a request to meet at a local park. Marcus was hesitant at first. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure what Ryan could possibly have to say. But curiosity, and perhaps a sense of closure, compelled him to agree. The park was quiet when Marcus arrived, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Ryan was already there, sitting on a bench and staring out at the small pond in the center. He looked older, his posture slouched, as though the weight of his actions had finally settled on his shoulders.